'Cause baby, I'm an anarchist.
Y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los reguetes.
This is the Circle Day Show on Resonance 104.4 FM. Joining me is Anarch and Re-Education Shorts, anarchists, educators who have a strong online presence. You can find their content on social media platforms such as TikTok, YouTube and Instagram. Tell us about the power of social media for getting your message across to the wider public as a form of education and consciousness raising. Why do you use social media platforms?
What anarchists used to do is go out to public areas and they would literally, soapbox. That is to say, they'd get up on some kind of platform and they would speak to people as they came by. They would go around handing out pamphlets and leaflets of various sorts. But we really don't live in that era anymore. I think our, public squares, the destruction of third spaces, pretty well moved on to the internet for our public squares. And I think a lot of people get their radicalization, get their information on the internet. And I don't suppose I'm reinventing the wheel here, but I think we all agree that, it's necessary to use these means that have been given to us to replace what we've lost.
I think that it's really good to use social media just because of the sheer range that you can get. I remember looking at some of the content that different people from different leftist backgrounds have been putting out, and they're getting out millions and millions of views. And I was like, I think that that's pretty comparable to the Communist Manifesto. I think the original run was a very small amount, and all of these people are producing all of this work. So I just think that it's a really great way to get that information out to a lot of people who really knows what kind of effect that's going to have in the future. Hopefully that might inspire something in somebody and get them on the path to, hopefully fight for a better future.
You often encourage questions from your viewership. Is engagement and stepping out of echo chambers important to you?
I want to be correct about as many things as I possibly can, and I want to be incorrect on as few things as I possibly can. And I think that the best way to do that is to be wrong about things sometimes. Once you find out that you're wrong about something, you can correct that thing. You can actually learn the truth behind it. You can come to a more correct position. When I ask a lot of these questions, I think for the most part, I'm actually getting feedback from the audience because there's a lot of brains working there. So hopefully everybody can kind of get together and tell me what they think. And in a large enough scale, not always, but typically people tend to lean to the correct position, even if they don't know that they're doing that. I tend to see a lot of interesting information come out. The criminal justice system and how we could reform it, or how anarchists could use it better, and that sort of thing. A lot of the posts that we were making about that was really formative in helping me come to a conclusion on where we should go with things. A bunch of different answers, and we kind of tried to find the ones that made the most sense and were the most humane. That's kind of why we love doing that sort of thing on the channel.
Of course, I want to be speaking with the people who are watching me. I would like my work to escape the echo chamber. There's no doubt about that. There's also some sense, however, that my work, I've always viewed my work as being at the end of the pipeline. When I first started the channel, that is to say back in 2020, there were a ton of channels that were doing introductory stuff. That was a very common sort of channel. Intro to anarchism, intro to socialism, et cetera, et cetera. And when I made the channel, I made it very consciously with the intention to create a channel that was going to kind of dig deep into philosophical, theoretical roots of leftist thought. I recognize that my work is meant to be at the end of that radicalization pipeline. I expect that the people that have come to my channel are probably people that have already begun absorbing a lot of the foundational, introductory stuff. By the time they get there, they're interested in the crunchy details. Obviously, I would love if such a deep dive were to be appealing to the average person outside of my echo chamber, but I also have some clear expectation that my work is probably going to appeal mostly to people that are already within our echo chambers or somehow a little bit adjacent to them. That being said, I've definitely been making a little bit of effort towards trying to do slightly more introductory topics lately.
Why is a good union important for the levelling out of power dynamics between the labourers and the owners of capital?
The whole idea is to get all of the workers together to collectively bargain. So collective bargaining essentially means that you go to your employer in force with many people all at once and ask for demands from your employer. If everybody's doing it all at once, then it's less likely that you yourself are going to get singled out, or you're going to be fired or anything like that, or even a small group of people. And what ends up happening now is, even though The idea of unions has been around for a long time. Capitalist businesses have figured out ways to essentially take control of those unions and make them not useful. Essentially, what they'll do is they'll make sure that there's a lot of anti-union propaganda. They'll do things with union leaders so that they can make sure that those union leaders are somewhat in their pocket. And it'll make it very hard for you to actually collectively bargain properly. They'll dissuade you from doing revolutionary action, like doing just simple things like sit-ins or occupying space, blocking people from being able to get inside of a building, that sort of thing. So a radical union opens up the possibilities for you to do all of the things, take all of the necessary action that you need so that you can actually collectively bargain against your employer. Whereas non-radical unions don't do any of those things and they dissuade you.
So I think that the union is just important as it has ever been. Still have to recognize that the union is sort of the fighting front in terms of economics. I guess there's two kinds of ways of looking at it. One is cooperatives and one is unions. The way I look at cooperatives, it's about literally just building the alternative structure, whereas the union is fighting or behind enemy lines, you might say. We have to be embedded in capital. That's kind of just one of the unnecessary realities of how we live in capitalism. And the union is how we do battle with the accumulation of capital itself. That is to say, we are stuck being in capitalist workplaces, and the union is the way that we fight back. It is the way that we say that, yes, even if we are forced into your workplaces, that we are not going to just acquiesce, that we are going to find our collective power, that we are going to bargain collectively. We're going to use that collective power in order to get concessions from you. We are going to make sure that you do not just extract all of the conceivable profit that you could from our labor. In other words, we are not going to be treated as slaves. We are going to essentially extract the maximum amount that we can for labor. The union's role goes further than that, I would say. It's not just about our fighting in the workplace. It's also about the union being able to combine into larger federations of workplace unions to the degree we start getting national federations. And it used to be in the past we had even international federations. Those still exist, but they're much less powerful than perhaps they once were. But, it used to be historically conceived that the union was the primary, organizational body, you might say, for fighting back against capitalism and in undergoing revolution. But I think today, now we are starting to develop a more holistic understanding that the union is one of many ways of doing battle with the capitalists. It's one of many ways of doing battle against the unified hierarchical power structures that we are up against. But it is nonetheless very important and remains as important as it ever was.
From boycotting, direct action to striking, what are the multiple forms of actions to consider when pushing for progressive change? And rather than criticizing others' tactics, is it better to complement a diverse approach to forms of action? Talk about the power and effectiveness of mass participation as long as it remains radical to the status quo.
Using a diversity of tactics is really the best way to be able to achieve your goals, right? If you're going out there and you're marching, if you're doing sit-ins, if you're doing demonstrations, if you're doing protests, all of those things are very important. But then there's also the other aspect where it's not just about the main event, it's about prolonged activity as well. So that could mean building dual power structures, creating free food stores or pool lending libraries, free medical clinics, that sort of thing. Different structures that allow you to create a system inside of the system that can help produce things for people. It can actually physically show them how living without capitalism can be effective. But you also have to consider what you're doing, when, and why. So there are a lot of protests going on right now that are less than radical. A lot of them are being put on by Walmart. A lot of them preach all of these anti-oligarchy ideals, but don't actually have any teeth to back them up. They don't have a real ideology behind them. And it's not that you shouldn't go to those protests. It's not like you shouldn't involve yourself. You should, but you have to know what you're getting into. So if you're in a radical protest, you're going to be around radicals and you're going to be fighting for a common goal. And that's important. If you're in a liberal protest, you're not necessarily going to be fighting for a common goal, at least one that you necessarily agree with fully. So what do? You try to change people's minds in the instance. One person that I seen at a No Kings protest, they essentially took the microphone and they started saying to people, hey, listen, this is put on by Walmart. This isn't radical action. This doesn't actually change things. Doing things like that really does help to push people towards a certain direction. And I think that those sorts of things are tactics that you have to keep in mind whenever you're doing any sort of resistance.
What are the effective methods that are available to us? I think that one of the things that is troubling is that some of the things that were once used, some of the tactics that were once used by radicals are far less effective than they once were. You know, the boycott used to be quite a bit more successful because the companies were just smaller and they had a fewer number of consumers. You know, when your company only serves 1,000 people, even getting 200 people together to boycott that company starts to be pretty significant. But when your company serves millions, maybe even billions of people in some occasions, it becomes very, very challenging to get together a coalition that can actually do any sort of successful boycott. Then you start having to have boycotts that are highly organized, have very clear sorts of aims to them. It's just a much more challenging tactic these days. Not to say that, of course, it might not have its place, and it certainly does. Historically, obviously, the South African boycott, that was definitely part and parcel to ending apartheid in South Africa. But the boycott is not nearly as powerful, I would say, these days as perhaps it once was for those reasons. The strike remains an extremely powerful tool. I think the strike is quite possibly one of the most powerful forms of direct action. It probably always will be. You know, what the system gets out of us is our labor. Its distribution of power roots from the work that we do. A strike is a clear demonstration. This is how the system would function if you didn't have us. If it were just you sitting there with all your money and administration, this is what would actually happen. Your system would fall apart. Your system would come to a screeching halt. There would be no system. So the strike remains an extremely powerful tool, but of course the strike requires large-scale coordination. So we're back to unions with that, but I suppose we can also have other forms of solidarity strikes. I would say that the strike is much less used these days, probably mostly because the unions have been very deeply co-opted by the state. The state has developed Byzantine regulations around what they are allowed to do, when they are allowed to strike. Solidarity strikes, for example, in the United States are illegal. You can only strike if you have met very certain circumstances. I think that has weakened the strike enormously. That is not to say, of course, the strike doesn't theoretically have the exact same strength. There's always going to have to be an appreciation for a diversity of tactics. I mean, that is just absolutely the foundation of effective praxis. Should we express criticism? I think that we should avoid expressing criticism externally, and we should avoid especially expressing criticism externally during actions. While the movement is acting, we should not be making public all of these concerns that we might have. But I do think that criticism is very necessary internally. I don't think we should fetishize it. We certainly don't want to get, I think a lot of people get really kind of obsessed with criticizing every little tiny mistake and detail of how other people act or how other people think. But I do think that it's absolutely necessary for there to be a process of self-criticism and criticism of the tactics that we've seen play out, recognizing where they did and did not work. But I think it's very important that criticism remains internal. And I think the only time that it should become external is kind of after things have subsided.
Your thoughts on the current wave of ICE, repression of the people, the US immigration officers currently cracking down on migrants?
My thought on it is that this is a repeat of Nazi Germany, very similar to what happened with the Gestapo. I think that it's terrifying. I talked to Daniel about this actually a little bit, just very briefly, and he used the term heartened to see people come out in solidarity with one another and actually fight against the system. And I feel very much the same way. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of liberal recuperation of a lot of these protests, unfortunately. I feel like they're really using the moment to kind of funnel people back into the Democratic Party and stuff like that. And I think that that's frustrating. But the grassroots actual movements that are on the ground that are fighting against that. The other thing, too, is I don't think that there is necessarily a liberal solution to this. When this has happened in the past, when fascism is on the rise, usually the only way to stop that is through some sort of conflict. It's not usually able to be voted away. The system, the structure doesn't allow for that sort of thing to be taken down. I hear a lot of liberals scream screaming and freaking out and saying, oh, it's illegal, it's illegal, they can't do this, they can't do this. They can do this. They are doing it. They're going to continue to do it. They're going to do it much worse, in fact. And unless something breaks, unless something completely crumbles, then it's going to continue like this.
I was very encouraged to see how fervently everybody revolted in LA. And I think a big part of it is that LA has a very significant Mexican immigrant population. And more even than that they are an immigrant population, they've been there for a very long time at this point. Many of them have been there for many generations, and some of them have even been there since before that was called California. So some people have ancestors going all the way back to when that was actually just Mexico in that area. One thing we saw there was that the reason why things escalated very quickly, specifically in LA, they were upset that ICE was literally like going into schools and targeting children who were expected to be migrants. This was just clearly a violation of a place that most people would expect would be safe, and they weren't okay with it. And what we saw was that they carried out very direct action. The SUVs were coming into the area. They were throwing rocks at them. They immediately began to take to the streets, and we saw an enormous amount of solidarity among the people that were there in LA. And of course, it's almost a stereotype here in the United States that LA knows how to riot. LA has had so many riots. It's like connected to the concept of LA almost. I will say that I think in a long-term sense, what it looks like for us to actually fight back against ICE, where I agree with Aaron, there's really not a liberal solution to the problem. I don't think they have the sort of political gumption to abolish ICE. The liberals are a weak opposition party. They are too cowardly to ever ask for something like that, let alone to actually try to put it into place if they were given power. We have to essentially resist ICE indefinitely. And I think what that looks like is people monitoring ICE very closely, making sure that we know every single time, anytime that they are doing any sort of structured kidnapping, there should be reports that is taking place to the whole community. We should have instant action networks where people immediately react to those reports. And I think that has been the biggest impediment to them. To the degree they've actually started to do these kidnappings at night, which I suppose is even more terrifying, but it's a demonstration that they recognize they have to evade being known to people in the area. They have to essentially do it in secret because they know that people are beginning to carry out this sort of monitoring direct action that's being discussed.
Is the pathological legacy behind the Red Scare and cultural Marxism preventing a majority of Americans from taking a positive attitude towards availability to free essential public services on demand for all, such as free healthcare?
I think that the Red Scare poisoned everything for a very long time. Even today, even after most people, even in my generation, didn't really hear about communism until the last few years, I think that the word communism and socialism really been poisoned and made to be seen as something that is extremely dangerous, akin to fascism. Most people don't even know what it means. I just had a conversation with somebody the other day that was talking about communism, and they are somewhat supportive of the ideas of communism, but they had no idea what the actual word itself meant. If you don't mention the word communism or socialism or anarchism to most people, they're generally approving of the idea. But the second that you mention those scary, naughty words, then everybody starts to recoil back. As far as people not being in favor of the ideas themselves, though, I think for the most part they are. It just depends on framing. Whenever people are running polls and that sort of thing, depending on how the question is framed, changes the answer of the person that's answering the question. So if you say, do you want to have cultural Marxism invading your schools and your hospitals, then most people will say, well, no. But if you say, hey, do you think that people deserve to have properly funded schools and cheap or free healthcare, they'll usually say yes.
I mean, the Red Scare absolutely was very impactful. I mean, a lot of people don't know there was actually two of them here in the United States. One of them started in the early 1900s. They started with the anarchists, sometimes called the Black Scare, where they literally were deporting them. A bunch of anarchists actually got deported to the USSR, or rather Russia, right at the time of the revolution. And then we had a second Red Scare, which I guess, we sometimes call McCarthyism. And that was very successful in changing the public imagination, which is to say, in creating a completely new conception of what socialism was and what communism was and the quote unquote threat of communism and so on. No, it's still very much pervasive today. I think mostly it was a propaganda victory in terms, as Aaron said. I think that that's a big part of it. I think that, when you talk to the average person about, the workers owning the means of production, that's something that a lot of people actually would agree with. I've talked to conservatives where all I will do is just say like, what I think the economy would be better if the people who worked in the workplaces owned the workplaces instead of people who just have a bunch of money, essentially, just the investors. They'll be like, yeah, I mean, that would be a lot better. And it's like, cool. I don't know if you know this, but you're a socialist is what you just told me. You're a socialist is what that means. Or I'll be like, I think that a society where we just didn't even have money, where everything was distributed from each according to their ability to each according to their need. That would probably be the best kind of society we could have, where everything is very determined very democratically from the bottom up. And they're like, yeah, that would be the ideal. And I'm like, cool, you just said the ideal is communism. I mean, I don't know if you know that, but I try not to engage in that kind of gotcha when I'm talking with people, but it does usually come up. And, I'm starting to come to this place where I'm just like, I don't care about what words are being used. I think we should be beginning to just build coalitions based on the concepts first. Do you agree the workers should own the means of production? Do you think it would be ideal if we had a society that was direct distribution from the workers to those in need? Would that be an ideal for you? And I think you find your coalitions open up quite a bit. So the Red Scare absolutely has done damage, but it didn't so much do damage to people's desires for liberation. It just muddied the waters. I think that's a big part of what it did. It essentially destroyed our connection with the history of these liberation movements, and it severed many oppressed peoples from those histories, such that they don't even know that there's any continuity between their struggle and the struggle of the people who carried out those past revolutions. It should be said, we also need to learn lessons about what they did there, because they're just going to do it again. The more successful we are, they're going to repeat those tactics again. They're already in the process of trying to repeat those tactics. So we have to be very flexible. We have to learn our lessons, and we have to think toward the future, trying to rebuild those coalitions with that in mind.
What is your 4 aspects framework for power and structures you've coined, and can you briefly describe them?
What I'm trying to do is develop a positive understanding of what it is we are seeking rather than just what it is that we wish to dismantle. Power is something that in classical anarchist texts is typically related with a concept of domination. So power over is domination, is the ability to make decisions for others, and it is also the ability to do harm to them if indeed they choose not to follow your commands. However, power 2 is a holistic conception of power. Power 2 is, I define it as the ability to enact one's will. Power, in my conception, is really something that you could not even conceivably abolish. Right now, I'm utilizing the power of my lungs and my vocal cords in order to communicate with you. So in my work, the concept of a power structure, they are comprised by individual conditioning. That involves everything about a person's individual self. That is their body, that is their mind, that is their ideology, but it's all contained there in the individual. Then there is interpersonality. That is a person's interactions, their real life interactions with friends, family, coworkers, people that they just know, acquaintances, etc. This is their interpersonality. Then you have social structures. These are the organizations that they are involved in. These are the sorts of rules and ethics are sort of like socially distributed. That would be a horizontal organization or a hierarchical organization that they are part of. Patriarchy, white supremacy, the state. These are all examples of social structures as well. The last of the 4 fields is what I call environmental structures. It's basically everything that is not humans in their conceptions. So that would include everything around me right now, this apartment I'm in, the entire building, the land that it's on. It would include the whole universe, essentially. So the prevailing power structures are what I would call a hierarchical power structure. That is to say that they are predicated on monopolization of the flow of power, monopolization of decision making, as well as domination. They get what they want through aggressive violence, through coercion, through threat, through deception. Horizontal power structures are based in distribution of decision making, and they're also then based in the opposite of domination. That is to say, what I would call mutuality, impulses of cooperation, impulses of self-defense, impulses of autonomy and dignity. Not to be too much of a math nerd, but it's kind of isomorphic to the old anarchist conception, but I've developed a new terminology, I suppose you might say.
Comment on our role as humans with ethical responsibilities towards sentient life around us.
Liberation, when it comes to human beings, should and must incorporate animals as well. Now, coming from me, that might be somewhat hypocritical. I'm not a vegan. I do try to get as many of the things that I eat locally sourced or not done through factory farming. It's not even just animals, but liberation of the earth itself. When the river isn't free for everybody to use, then somebody can claim that and can pollute it and can destroy it. If the land isn't free, then they can do the same thing. They can pollute, they can destroy, they can take advantage, right? They can take it from you and give it to themselves. And we need that to truly move forward if we want to be a better species.
I think that this is something that has been neglected historically by a lot of anarchists and even anarchist revolutionaries. This comes from an Enlightenment conception that we are separate from nature, that we are something above and beyond nature, not just part of it, but something that has now transcended nature, that nature is a thing to be used, to be extracted from, that the world is simply a stage for the actions of humans, and that humans are the only thing that is important. So I guess we might call this anthropocentrism. And I think that this is explicitly damaging and dangerous. And I think this leads us to an environmentally destructive orientation with nature. It also leads to us just being plain exploitative towards other living things, seeing other things as means rather than ends, and not caring about the well-being of animals, not caring about the well-being of our ecosystems. I think that it's impossible to have a healthy functioning horizontal power structure that disregards the importance of those environmental structures. And it's part of the reason why I made it one of those four fields. My conception of a power structure is because I think that the environment is holistically intertwined, and our relation to the environment is holistically intertwined with the revolutionary project itself.
How did examples of healthy models of indigenous communities sort out disputes, the minor and serious, without the legal framework system we've come accustomed to and taken as normal?
Personally, I've drawn a lot from examples of indigenous people, the Zapatistas and the Iroquois Confederacy, but also just kind of a lot of the generalized relations of indigenous peoples to the land, as well as the way that they resolve disputes, or rather what they think the priorities are in the resolution of disputes. One thing that I notice in a lot of indigenous communities is that they resolve disputes not because they are necessarily just trying to repair the relationship between two individuals. That's part of it, and that's important. But it's instead that they are trying to repair a rift that has been created in the community. The default conception of the importance of sociality, that when two individuals have been split apart from one another, that there is a harm that has been done, that there is a dispute or a conflict that can't be resolved. This is not just an individual problem. This is a social problem now. This now leads to coalitions being splintered, families not being able to get together because now they have problems between a cousin and another cousin, or whatever it may be. And so their orientation is always towards a sort of rehabilitative or restorative form of justice rather than a punitive form of justice. Because a punitive form of justice, has this sort of default conception that everybody's an individual. The only important thing is restitution to individuals. Therefore, you don't care if a person gets punished. You don't care if it damages the social fabric. Putting that person in a prison, harming that person as retaliation, that's all well and good because you have no orientation towards community.
Do you think that fear has a major role to play in the inability of imagining that another world is possible?
I don't know so much if it's fear or if it is the spectacle. There was an author back, I believe it was in the 70s, called Guy Debord. He basically broke down the idea of capitalism as being a totalitizing force that is essentially all-consuming to everything within the system. So much so that it's hard for people to even imagine a world outside side of capitalism. I said before, it's not even that it's unthinkable, it's not even thought of at all, because the totalitizing force of capitalism is such that it makes you believe that there is nothing else. So it's not even necessarily that people are afraid of a better world or a different solution. It's that they don't know that any other solution exists. And even if they were to find out that it does exist, they would fight against it instinctively because of that totalitizing spectacle. Motivational speaker Tony Robbins, he talks about how the story isn't necessarily true, but it's an interesting analogy. He talks about a baby elephant being tied to a stake set into the ground. And when the baby elephant is too small, it can't pull the stake out of the ground. So it eventually stops trying to escape because it can't move. As that elephant grows, the stake stays the same size, but the elephant already has it ingrained in its brain that it can't pull that stake out, so it doesn't even try to do it.
A lot of the reason why that people accept more conservative notions is fear of change, is fear of what things might be otherwise. I think a lot of the time that conservatism arises from a conception that what is must be. And maybe even moreover, that what is should be. It's a conception that if things were to be different, something bad would be happening. If what is should be, then what isn't shouldn't be. And I think that that is certainly an operative part of the psychology of conservatism. Progress may not even be progress. They're terrified of these conceptions of change we might regard as progress, which is to say equality of people's outcomes as well as their opportunities, people deserving to be treated better, us having standards for the treatment of all people regardless of their identity and so on. You might then therefore be terrified that that is not progress, but regress. And what you want is a form of regression. You want to go backwards to something that you think was somehow safer, that was somehow more harmonious. And this then brings about the impulse of fascism.
Make America great again.
Exactly.
I've heard you talk about the primitivist end civilization strand of anarchism. What are its flaws, if any, that you'd object to?
My problem is that they have an anti-technology stance. They believe that the problems that we are facing are based on the proliferation of technology. I don't hold that opinion. I'm not a techno-optimist. By contrast, I instead take sort of Bookchin's view on technology, which is that technology is what it is based on how it is embedded in a social fabric. It is what it is based on how it is being utilized, how it affects other people, what its relation is to other people. So this really comes down to a concept of sort of nature and nurture, except now we're talking about the nature and the nurture of a technology. There's some capacity of it, which is based on its inherent nature, base construction, you might say. And there's some aspect of it that it's really based on its relationality. And what I would like to argue is that most tools, it's based in the latter half. It's more of the nurture part than it is the nature part. But that's not universal. There are, for example, technologies where the nature portion clearly just excludes that thing having liberatory potential, or it's so niche as to be almost not worth talking about. One thing that I think the problem is that primitivists conceive then that all of this development of technology is purely nature and its nature is negative, right? That its nature is harmful, that its nature empowers domination. And I think in my mind, the way I look at it is just that the system has had longer to integrate all of the technologies that are developed. And therefore, it has had longer to put them to use subjugating the people. And therefore, of course, it's going to look like the technology itself is bad because the enemy has had so much time to develop its usage and to implement it and to make it a part of our everyday lives. So that's my biggest beef with primitivism. That is to say, I also have no desire to return to a quote unquote primitive way of living. I don't think that society, that humans want that. And I don't think that's going to solve our problems. I think that it's Pandora's box. The knowledge is out of the box. It's never going back in. The question is, how do we integrate it with a liberatory society? But then you also mentioned anti-civilization. I want to make a note here that a lot of people who consider themselves anti-civ don't consider themselves primitivists. And this is just because of the way that they define this phrase civilization. So a lot of them, if you really get down to the nitty gritty and you ask them, what do you mean by civilization? They mean what I described by hierarchical power structures a minute ago, right? They essentially believe that civilization is a hierarchical power structure. And so in that sense, when a lot of these people express that they're anti-civ, they're just saying they're anti-hierarchy. Sometimes you'll read anti-civ literature and it doesn't sound primitivist at all. It's really going to be very much an individual thing. I will say that still you'll hear some very primitivist sounding biases mixed in a lot of the time, which is why I think that probably a post-civilization perspective is a little more rational.
What is a leader in an anarchist context? And is it counterproductive to isolate and elevate the status of any one individual in any cause?
I would say that there can be leaders in anarchism. I think that the difference is just that they are not empowered structurally. So I think it's natural to some degree that people who spend a lot of their time and effort studying and writing, also just being embedded in the movement, are going to be people that others look up to or go to for answers to questions. I don't even think that that is necessarily a problem. I mean, I think that, a system works best when everybody does what comes naturally to them, the things that they want to do, the things they are driven to do. And in that occasion, we're always going to have forms of specialization. And so leadership is essentially a specialization of vision, a specialization of strategic understanding in anarchism. But that does not mean that just because they have that understanding that they get to make decisions for everyone else. It may be that people will defer to those organic leaders, which is what I tend to call it, organic leadership. But those leaders will never be structurally empowered to command everyone. I think that's the big difference. So this goes all the way back to Bakunin talking about that he respects the authority of the bootmaker. And I think that the same thing applies here in this context. I do think, however, that of course cults of personality are dangerous. It doesn't really matter what the context is. In our context, wherein we have some form of horizontal power structure or even federations of horizontal power structures, it of course could become a problem. Cults of personality could lead people to make irrational decisions, could lead to people not making decisions which are in the best interests of themselves and those around them. That's just something that you have to watch for in every system. I don't think that in any way that would be a unique problem for anarchism. I think that is a problem for every kind of system.
It absolutely can be detrimental if that leadership position tends to be prolonged or goes over and above the basic reason why it exists in the first place. Anarchism doesn't necessarily say that there should be no leaders at all. Well, Noam Chomsky says unjustified hierarchy. I don't necessarily love that framing. I like to say that we want to create systems that remove domination. And it's an active force. We actively try to remove domination whenever we see it or whenever it arises. When it comes to leadership, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a leader to do a certain thing. Sometimes leaders will evolve and come about naturally. You'll have, for instance, in a teacher-student relationship, a person that assumes a leadership role in teaching somebody. But it's not necessarily a hierarchy. More or less, it's a guiding force. You're more or less using your abilities to be able to teach somebody else or guide somebody else towards doing something that's important. On a construction site, you're going to default to the guy that knows how to lay the bricks fastest or the person that can put up drywall the best. That's how you're going to end up having those leadership positions.
We don't want to worship them either, do we?
You don't want to have a cult of personality arise from somebody. And the idea about anarchism, too, is that when we do vote on things, it's a direct democracy that votes on policy, not people that make policies.
The individual is important, but not at the expense of the group. The group is important, but not at the expense of the individual. Is it a balancing act, finding a cohesive societal ecosystem?
I don't know if it's necessarily so much of a balancing act as it is just kind of in line with how human behavior usually is. When we're in community with one another, we don't usually put ourselves above that community. Sometimes we do, obviously. There are some situations where you put yourself above everybody else. But traditionally, we usually work within community very egalitarianly. We're usually one-on-one with another person. So I don't necessarily think that it's a difficult balancing act, but when we're already propagandized to so much within our current structure to believe that people need to have leaders and need to worship others and that sort of thing. That's when like the propaganda essentially creates the idea that there is that balancing act. In any system where we're trying to get towards a more egalitarian solution, there's going to be a growth period and a learning period where we actually, or an unlearning period really, where we unlearn these sorts of behaviors and try to work towards being in a more equal society. That could take time. We believe in prefiguration, so we think that it should happen beforehand rather than afterwards. But really, a before, during, and after solution needs to be approached as well. I think that's the way that we should be looking at it.
Common question comes up about crime from people unfamiliar with anarchism. Anarchists focus on prevention rather than punishment. If we are serious about reducing the reasons for crime, is it fair to say that the state doesn't want to actually resolve the issues of crime in any serious way because a population getting along fine would make a state obsolete? And so long-term solutions towards tackling all the various reasons violent crime is committed is not really at the top of its agenda. Is it mere authoritarian rhetoric rolled out during election time?
For the most part, people on their own are able to work out disagreements, work out grievances, and that sort of thing. When the state comes in and starts making all of these decisions and starts creating all of these laws and that sort of thing to regulate people's behavior, that's when it creates a power structure and a dynamic that is physically weaponized against poor people, against minorities, against people that have no power in that system. You can see right now we have essentially a two-tier justice system, or even a three-tiered justice system, where the most oppressed among us have absolutely no power. They have nothing that they can do about being incarcerated or being charged with a crime. People in the middle bracket, sometimes they get away with it, sometimes they don't, but for the most part, they can get away with things. And then you have the 1% who commit heinous, atrocious crimes, constantly killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all of the time, and completely get away with it scot-free. There is, in fact, not even punishment. They're rewarded for doing exactly that. And that, of course, upholds structures of patriarchy, it holds structures of capitalism, of domination, of the oppressors oppressing the poorest amongst us. At its very baseline, the thing that is causing all of these problems is the dynamic between the oppressors and the oppressed.
Burnout is all too common among activists. Can you highlight the importance of looking after yourself as an activist?
What I have seen over the course of many years now, whenever an activist starts out, they burn real hot, real fast, but they burn out quickly. We don't want that. You have to start small with things. You have to start at the baseline. I've lost people because of that, if that makes sense. You can't help anybody if you haven't first been able to help yourself. If you're weak, if your energy is low, if you haven't slept, if you can't get enough food to eat, if you can't get enough time in the day, take a moment and relax. It's okay. There are other people out there that are fighting too. You have to make sure that inaction doesn't overtake action, that restoration doesn't overtake your ability to actually go out there and fight for things.
We know that there were people who, entire movements of people, in fact, that pushed themselves absolutely to the breaking point, where there was nothing left of them, where they destroyed their entire lives for the goal, for the cause. I think we all recognize to some degree that that is necessary in order to get things done. Like, people really do have to practice some amount of self-sacrifice. But then this has to be balanced with an understanding that this really is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You have to maintain yourself. You have to maintain this engine that is your personhood. That's a physical, that's psychological, because if you just destroy yourself, pushing too hard, too fast, well, then you can't even successfully self-sacrifice at a later date. If that is your conception, that you have a conception of self-sacrifice that is deep, that is all the way down to like a spiritual level, well, you have to recognize you need to upkeep yourself well enough that you could do that for a long time. There is this sort of balance between the conceptions that we have to find, because you can go too far in the opposite direction, where what you do is you convince yourself that you don't need to do hard things, you don't need to get outside of your comfort zone, that it's all about that self-care just means never pushing yourself, never experiencing difficulty, never feeling sad, never feeling angry, and instead always putting yourself in this place of safety and ease. I think that you absolutely can correct too far in either direction. And I've seen it myself in the movement. I've seen people that, use self-care, this phrase self-care, as an excuse to just not do things. in order to not challenge themselves. But I've also seen people that push way, way too hard, and as you say, burn themselves out. I think a big part in being a successful organizer is always finding that balance. If you burn out, then you're going to drop the ball. And when you drop the ball, it doesn't just affect you. It affects the whole community, affects the whole organization you're part of. So you need to learn when to just pull back a little bit, right? You just need to take your foot off the gas pedal for a little while, rest up, just get some sleep. That balance is what is necessary for people to be good organizers, and more than that, to be revolutionaries.
Intersectional politics. Considering ways in which oppression affects others in ways we can overlook because we may be unaffected by it ourselves, how can being self-reflective about our privileges in this system contribute to better understanding of how we interact with one another on an interpersonal level?
Intersectional organizing is not just a good solution, it's the only solution moving forward. I'm sick and tired of white people thinking that they can jump into the middle of a battle that they've just barely recently found out about and think that they can save everybody because they're somehow superheroes or John Wick or something like that. You're not. You don't know what you're doing. You don't have any good solutions, and maybe those few good solutions that you think you do have already been talked about at length by people that have been in this fight and can't get out of it for years, decades, generations. Without intersectional organizing, you can never actually break the chains because you don't even really know what the chains are. You don't know where they are. You don't know how heavy they are. Be humble, listen, take advice, and like you were saying, always reflect on how things need to be gone about, because at the end of the day, we're fighting in the same battle.
How come revolution often goes wrong, and what are the lessons we can draw from them as anarchists?
Anarchists are right in their analysis of domination. Hierarchy is the root of the problem, but that doesn't mean that therefore they produce the solutions to that problem accurately. And so what we see is this is where the enormous diversity of different perspectives in anarchism comes from, is that so many different people have so many different perspectives on what the solutions are. So I'm going to answer the question as my perspective as an anarchist, and that is that I think we need strong organization. I think that what we've seen is that anarchists do best when we accept that we need organization, that we need collective interest, that we need community building, that we have to practice solidarity at its core in a very serious way. And that requires us to work through our difficulties. That requires us to do the hard work of building organizations. That requires us to have a far view that is not just in the next few months, next few years, but maybe decades. Kind of bringing back around to the discussion we had a moment ago about indigenous cultures, this concept of the 7 generations principle. And that is the concept that everything we are doing, we should understand it as being planned for what it will do in 7 generations. You know, that we are imagining that everything we are doing will have impact 7 generations down the line, and ask ourselves how our work will affect other people's work 7 generations away from us. Anarchists need to have this much larger term view where we're thinking in the terms of decades and centuries rather than thinking in the short term of just trying to form an affinity group that is just going to attend a protest, and the protest is going to be really fun and cool, and then we're going to do something that probably feels like it's affecting a lot, but then protests end and we realize we have no power and we've achieved very little. Not to say that it's not good, that that's not a valid thing to do and that it's not worthwhile, but that I think that a lot of anarchists have gotten very caught up in this sort of eternal protest cycle, where the only thing they're thinking about is when is the next protest? What is my affinity group going to do? And that's all well and good, but that will never build a different world. The only way you build a different world is by building an alternative. That is the way the capitalists did it, right? If you look at the history, the only successful revolution that has ever taken place is the revolution of the capitalists. The capitalists, they victored over feudalism. And they didn't do it through a series of coups. They didn't do it by protests. They did it by building capitalism within feudalism. And that was a long process that began in like the 1500s in a really earnest sort of way. And it did not really come to fruition until probably about the 1800s. And then you got coups because the capitalists had the power to do a coup. Whereas I think that a lot of what we do these days is we're obsessed with the revolutionary coup. We want to do a revolutionary coup, but we don't have power. We don't have the alternative structures. So a lot of why I've started to try to frame anarchism in this positive way, speaking about power structures, is because I want people to think in this positive way about construction. What are you building? How is it going to have longevity? How is it going to self-perpetuate over time? I think this is the key. When we look at every success that the anarchists have had, it has been based on this conception of a long-term thinking, of a strong organizational ethos, the positive construction of power.
Go back to the saviorism aspect of it. Some people think that they can guide everybody else through a revolution and that it'll be successful. But once you've put your faith into a strong man, once you put your revolution into the hands of somebody else, you've given up that power. You've given up your ability to actually create a successful egalitarian solution. And that's exactly why a lot of revolutions in the past maybe weren't unsuccessful. They were successful, but what were they successful at doing? They were successful at recreating state structure and authoritarianism. We recreated that power dynamic of the oppressor versus the oppressed every single time. And the reason why that is because we haven't tackled the main problem. And the main problem is that exact dynamic. It's not about capitalism, though that is an aspect of it. It's not about the economy, though that is an aspect of it. It's not about any number of individual situations. It's about that initial problem, that primary contradiction, if you want to use a Marxist term. If we outsource our revolution to somebody else, it's never going to be a full revolution. So we have to take arms ourselves. We have to be able to fight ourselves. We have to work together with each other and not rely on somebody else to do it for us, because there is no one else but us.
Talk about the importance of putting into practice theory, practicing what you preach, but then also learning from theory, not branding it as a pointless armchair intellectualism, and not just constantly reinventing the wheel.
Theory informs praxis, and praxis informs theory, and the two have to work hand in hand for them to be useful. I relate this somewhat to the scientific method, right? We are constantly testing and trying to find out what solutions work the best. We don't necessarily know when we create our initial hypothesis, so we have to run a bunch of different tests and write down all of the solutions that we came up with, what worked, what didn't, what were the repercussions, all of those sorts of things. That's scientific socialism, if you will, right? Finding out what is the best solution to achieve socialism. So reading theory allows you to get that information. Essentially, you're able to crack open that science textbook and see all of the different experiments that were done in the past, find out how they were done, what they were doing, and how they're successful, and then creating a solution for yourself. And those solutions are going to be different with your material conditions and throughout history, where you live, time period you're living in, and that sort of thing. You'll realize after a certain amount of time, if you're really into anarchist theory, that even if you want to be, just reading all of the time and talking about that, you're going to be compelled. And I'm not even kidding you. Everybody I know becomes compelled to go out and do something, because anarchism isn't just a book club. It's an active force trying to achieve a goal. So eventually you're going to be out there, you're going to be in the streets. You better know what you're doing out there. So you got to read at least a little bit. Listen to podcasts.
Like these ones.
Yes.
Anarchism doesn't mean lawlessness. Returning to some Wild West scenario, we can appreciate there are benefits to having laws of the land. Can you speak to the reservations people have about feeling safe living with an anarchist approach to life?
You know, whether anarchism is lawlessness is going to be the large part down to how you define laws, right? Anarchists have defined law as being those rules which are imposed from above. Those rules that come from a hierarchical power structure downwards onto the people, that the people themselves have no will in creating, have no will in editing, but instead are victim of. And in that sense, you could say then, yeah, anarchism is lawlessness, but I don't think that that would mean what we would hope it would mean to the average person, right? If you were to tell somebody anarchism is lawlessness, they're not going to hear, oh, all of the rules will be developed by the people and the people will come together and make these compacts and agreements which will bind their actions. That's not what they hear when they hear anarchism is lawlessness. You have to then discuss this conception of law and what they mean by law, and then you have to have this sort of back and forth wherein the two of you kind of dialogically determine what you mean by law and whether it would or would not then exist within an anarchist society. In my conception, however, I should note, there is some strong contingent of the anarchist movement that then also doesn't even want those rules, right? They don't even, there are a significant portion of the movement that even if we were to talk about these rules that are developed from the bottom up, that are constructed through processes of consensus and collective agreement, they still wouldn't support them. And that's why I note that there are these distinctions within anarchism. I don't place myself within that camp. I definitely think that any society that will exist will always have rules and compacts and boundaries, and that boundaries are productive. Boundaries give us a substrate on which we can build. They create a foundation of expectations so that people know what to expect from others, to know that a person is not going to do a particular thing because you've all come to an agreement, or that a person will do a particular thing because you've all come to an agreement. I think that is valuable, that's good, that any functioning society at any scale is going to require it. That's the discourse that exists on that subject.
Obviously, anarchism isn't lawlessness. It's not chaos. It's not the lack of people being able to organize or work together or be safe. Anarchism is the idea that we remove rulers. We are against the oppressor, and we want to liberate the oppressed. That's it. That's what anarchism is about. All of these other things about how we need to interact with one another and how we need to socialize properly and how we need to follow certain rules or dynamics, none of that is against the idea of anarchism. You brought up earlier, the individual's rights can't supersede the community, and the community's rights can't supersede the individual, and how that's a balancing act. Well, this is exactly where the rubber meets the road within anarchism, where we work together all of the time in small communities without cops or the government having anything to do with it to find out how we're supposed to work together with each other. Of course, crimes are going to be committed. I'm not saying that anarchism is all of a sudden this magical force that eliminates all crime or eliminates all poverty, or, well, hopefully eliminates all poverty, but eliminates all possibility of things that are negative happening. But what we want to do is make sure that there is no chance that those things do happen, or at least reduce those chances. So that's why we think about preemptive strategies to eliminate the possibility of those crimes. That's the general idea about anarchism, is that we can have rules, but there is no real reason why we need to defer to some dude to find out what those rules are. You're perfectly capable. You're an adult human being, most of you. You can make those decisions on your own, or hopefully together in groups.
You've been listening to The Circle Day Show on Resonance 104.4 FM. Find us on www.thecircleday.com. Thank you both again, Anarch and Re-Education Shorts. Until next time, turn on, tune in and kick off.
Cause baby, I'm an anarchist.